What if the person you loved most betrayed you in the worst way possible? Garrett thought his life was perfect, until the shocking truth shattered everything. An affair, money laundering, a web of lies too dark to ignore. Now, with everything at stake, Garrett has no choice but to confront the woman he once trusted. But can he expose the truth without losing everything he holds dear? Watch as the suspense builds, secrets unravel, and a life once built on love falls apart. Will justice prevail? Or will Garrett lose everything in the end? Watch the full story unfold. Garrett McKinley was a man of routine. He woke up each day at 6 a.m., prepared coffee for himself and his wife, Daphne, and sent their 2 children off to school. By the time he was in his office, he had already planned his day down to the minute. A successful interior designer in Charleston, his life was supposed to be perfect. His clients admired his work, his friends respected him, and most importantly, his family was everything to him. But recently, things felt different. Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Daphne, his wife of 12 years, had become increasingly distant. She was still beautiful, still the woman he had fallen in love with, but something in her eyes was different. There were days when she would smile at him, but the warmth wasn't there. She would nod when he spoke, but her mind seemed to be somewhere else. Their conversations had become sparse, and her once loving touch had been replaced by a coldness Garrett couldn't explain. It wasn't until he found the text message that everything started to fall apart. He was cleaning up the kitchen late one night when his phone buzzed, and Daphne's phone lay on the counter beside him. She had left it there when she ran upstairs to take a shower. The message was brief, but enough to ignite a storm in Garrett's chest. "You're perfect. Can't wait to see you tonight." There was no name attached to the message, just a number Garrett didn't recognize. His heart raced. He told himself it was probably nothing, just a work message or a friend joking around. But the words, "Can't wait to see you," echoed in his mind like a bad song. He knew then that something wasn't right. Daphne returned from the shower, oblivious to the storm that had just formed in Garrett's heart. She greeted him with a smile, but he could barely look her in the eye. "Everything okay, Gar?" she asked, brushing a strand of wet hair behind her ear. Garrett stared at her for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. "Who was that message from?" His voice was calm, but inside every nerve was on edge. Daphne looked momentarily surprised, then glanced at the phone. She picked it up, quickly unlocking it with a swipe. "Oh, that's from Paul. He's just making some plans for the charity event next month," she said nonchalantly. Paul. The name hit Garrett like a hammer. He'd met Paul a few times at charity events and business meetings. He was Daphne's co-worker and, from what Garrett had seen, a charming man. Too charming. "And why does he call you perfect?" Garrett's voice was sharper now. Daphne froze for a moment, then laughed it off. "You're always so paranoid, Gar. You know how Paul is. He's a flirt, always joking around. You shouldn't take it seriously." Garrett nodded, but deep down, doubt began to creep into his mind. It wasn't just the text message. It was everything. The way Daphne had been acting lately, how her attention was divided, how she seemed to slip away whenever he tried to engage her. The coldness between them had grown so much that Garrett felt like a stranger in his own home. He swallowed hard, pushing the feelings down. He couldn't believe this was happening to him. His marriage, his life, felt like it was unraveling before his eyes, but he wasn't going to let it break him, not without answers. "I'm sorry," Daphne said, her voice softening. "I've been stressed with work. I'll make it up to you. Let's have a date night this weekend, just the 2 of us." Garrett nodded again, though he didn't believe her words. Date night. It felt like a hollow gesture, as if saying the words could fix everything. But he knew deep down that the cracks in their marriage weren't something a simple night out could heal. As he lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, Garrett made a silent promise to himself. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. The days following Garrett's discovery of the text message felt like a storm was quietly gathering around him. His mind replayed the conversation with Daphne over and over. "Just a work thing," she had said, brushing it off with that same practiced smile. But every time he looked at her, a coldness lingered. It was as though she had retreated into herself, and Garrett was left to watch her from the outside. Doubt had crept into his thoughts, growing steadily with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something far bigger than just a fleeting moment of mistrust. Daphne had been distant for weeks, no, months, and now, with this new piece of information, everything felt like it was crumbling in slow motion. One evening, as Garrett sat alone in the kitchen after dinner, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced down at the screen and his heart skipped a beat. It was an anonymous text. "I saw them today. You need to know what's happening." There was no name, no number, just those chilling words. Garrett's pulse quickened. It was like a voice had whispered directly into his ear, confirming the suspicions he'd been trying so hard to ignore. His breath caught in his throat, and for a long moment he just stared at the screen, unsure what to do next. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the urge to respond battling with his need to understand what was truly going on. Who had sent this? Was it someone who knew something? Or was it just a cruel trick to push him over the edge? Garrett didn't reply. Instead, he opened a new message, his fingers shaking slightly as he typed in a simple request. "What do you mean? Who is this?" He pressed send and waited. Seconds felt like hours, but no response came. He stared at the phone for a while longer, the silence deafening. He couldn't sit still. The uncertainty gnawed at him. The weight of the unknown was unbearable. He grabbed his jacket and, without telling Daphne, he left the house. He needed answers. The quiet whispers of betrayal in his mind were growing louder, and he couldn't ignore them anymore. Garrett drove through the empty streets, his thoughts racing. He thought about calling Rick, but part of him didn't want to share his suspicions just yet. He wasn't ready to face the truth. Maybe if he didn't speak it aloud, it wouldn't be real. But deep down, he knew. Something was happening, and it was happening right under his nose. As he drove, a single thought echoed in his head. How long has this been going on? How long had Daphne been lying to him? How long had she been seeing Paul? Garrett found himself outside the cafe, where he knew Daphne and Paul had met on more than one occasion. He parked his car a block away, watching the entrance from behind the shadows of the trees. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he waited. Minutes passed slowly, each one weighing heavier than the last. And then, there they were. Daphne and Paul, walking down the street, talking to each other as though nothing were wrong. Daphne laughed at something Paul said, her hand brushing against his arm. Garrett's stomach turned. It was like a knife twisting in his gut. Seeing it with his own eyes, the evidence staring him in the face, made everything so much worse. He didn't need to hear the conversation. The way they moved together, the easy chemistry between them. It was all too clear. He watched them for a few more moments, the sinking feeling in his chest growing stronger. But then something unexpected happened. Paul turned, catching Garrett's eye for the briefest second. There was a momentary flicker of recognition, a brief flash of discomfort in Paul's gaze. It didn't last long, but it was enough to make Garrett feel like he had been seen. Daphne, unaware of Garrett's presence, continued walking with Paul. But the brief glance from Paul had told Garrett everything he needed to know. This wasn't just some harmless fling, this was something real, something that had been going on behind his back for far too long. Garrett turned and walked back to his car, his mind spinning. He had seen enough. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His marriage, the life they had built, was unraveling before his eyes. And the worst part? He didn't know how to fix it. Garrett sat at his desk late that night, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, replaying the events of the day over and over. The image of Daphne and Paul laughing together on the sidewalk haunted him, but it was the look in Paul's eyes that stuck with him. The moment their gazes locked for just a split second. It was as if Paul knew he had been caught. Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. It wasn't just the affair. There were layers hidden beneath the surface, things he hadn't yet uncovered. His marriage wasn't just falling apart. It was being systematically destroyed. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The phone buzzed on the table, snapping him back to reality. It was Rick. Garrett hadn't told him about what he had seen that evening, but now, with everything spiraling out of control, He couldn't keep this from his best friend any longer. "Garrett," Rick's voice crackled through the phone, "I've got the financial documents you asked for. You were right. There's something off about the way Daphne's been handling the accounts. I don't know the full picture, but I found some inconsistencies. This might be bigger than just an affair." Garrett's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I found multiple transfers to a third-party account, someone named Paul Henson, and the amounts are substantial, more than you'd think." Rick paused for a moment, the gravity of his words sinking in. "This isn't just an affair, Garrett. This is about money. And Paul isn't just a guy she's been seeing. There's something else going on." Garrett felt his stomach drop. He had always trusted Daphne with everything, his finances, his business, his life. But now, it seemed like everything he had believed was a lie. "I need everything you've got, Rick," Garrett said, his voice tight. "I don't care what it takes, I need to know everything." Rick assured him he would send over the documents immediately. Hanging up, Garrett leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had thought he was only dealing with an unfaithful wife, but now he realized it was much more, something far darker. The next morning, Garrett went through the documents Rick had sent. His hands shook as he scrolled through each page. The numbers, the transfers, the accounts, it was all there, hidden in plain sight. Daphne had been siphoning money from their joint accounts for months. Large sums, all directed to Paul Henson's company. Garrett's mind raced. How could she do this? How could Daphne betray him like this? The betrayal stung far more than the affair. The money wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was an outright theft. Daphne had been living a double life, and now Garrett had to decide how far he was willing to go to uncover the full extent of her lies. He had to confront her, but not just about the affair. This was about everything. Her deceit, her manipulation, and the financial wreckage she had left in her wake. Garrett's hand hovered over his phone. He thought about calling Daphne, demanding the truth, but he knew that confronting her without the full picture would only give her the chance to spin another web of lies. He needed more than just her word. He needed proof, the kind of proof that couldn't be denied. With a sigh, Garrett put down the phone. He wasn't going to confront her just yet. He needed to prepare. This was no longer just about saving his marriage. It was about reclaiming his life. The next few days were a blur. Garrett spent every waking hour gathering more information, meeting with Rick, and pulling apart every layer of Daphne's web. The truth, as it unfolded, was uglier than he had ever imagined. The affair, the money laundering, the manipulation, it all pointed back to Paul Henson, and Garrett realized that Paul was not just a casual affair partner, he was part of something much larger. The more Garrett uncovered, the more his anger and disbelief grew. It wasn't just Daphne who had betrayed him, it was the entire life they had built together. But now, there was no turning back. He had the evidence, and he was going to make sure that Daphne's secrets were exposed for the world to see. The grand ballroom was alive with music and chatter, the hum of conversation blending with the clinking of glasses. It was the charity gala, an event Garrett had been looking forward to for weeks, but now all he could feel was a suffocating weight pressing down on him. He was supposed to be enjoying the night, celebrating his success, yet every glance at Daphne made his chest tighten. Tonight, everything felt wrong. The laughter, the smiles, none of it reached his heart. Daphne was standing across the room, her smile radiant as usual, talking to a group of guests. She looked stunning in a deep red gown, her hair perfectly styled, but Garrett noticed the subtle tension in her posture, the way her eyes flicked nervously when they made eye contact. His mind raced. He couldn't wait any longer. He had the proof. He had seen them together at the cafe, heard the whispers, and now he needed to confront her. "Garrett, darling, you look amazing," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Emily, Rick's wife, her warm smile a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. "Thanks, Emily." He forced a smile, but his eyes immediately drifted back to Daphne. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked, noticing his distracted gaze. Garrett took a deep breath. He hadn't confided in anyone about what he'd discovered, not even Rick. But tonight, with everything weighing on him, he couldn't keep it in anymore. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he said quietly, more to himself than to Emily. She tilted her head, her expression shifting from lightheartedness to concern. "Garrett, what's going on?" "I know what's been happening," he confessed, his voice raw. "I saw them, Daphne and Paul, and it's not just an affair. It's everything. She's been hiding things from me, things that go deeper than I ever imagined." Emily's face softened, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she murmured. "But you're not alone in this. Whatever happens, you'll get through it." Garrett nodded, grateful for her support, but feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Thanks, Emily," he said quietly, before his gaze shifted back to Daphne, who was now laughing with Paul, her hand resting casually on his arm. The sight twisted Garrett's stomach into knots. He excused himself from Emily and walked across the room toward Daphne. The noise of the gala faded into the background as his footsteps seemed to echo louder with each stride. He could feel the eyes of the guests on him, but he was too far gone to care. This was it. No more running, no more hiding. "Daphne!" he called as he reached her, his voice calm but firm. She turned, a surprised smile on her face, but it faltered when she saw the look in his eyes. "Garrett, what are you doing here? You should be mingling." "I'm done mingling," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Daphne's smile faded completely, and she looked around nervously, as if she was hoping someone would come to her rescue. Paul stepped closer, sensing the tension between them. "I think we should just go outside for a moment," Garrett continued, his eyes fixed on Daphne. "Now!" Daphne glanced at Paul, who offered a tight smile before stepping back, sensing the inevitable confrontation. She hesitated for a brief moment, but then nodded reluctantly. "All right, let's go." They made their way outside, Garrett's heart hammering in his chest. The cool night air hit him as they stepped onto the terrace, and for a moment, it felt like the world had frozen around them. There was no music, no distractions, just the two of them, standing on the edge of a precipice. "What's going on, Garrett?" Daphne asked, trying to sound calm, but her voice trembled slightly. "You're acting like you know something." "I do," Garrett said, his voice unwavering. "I know everything." Daphne's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "I saw you," he said, his voice low but full of anger. "I saw you with Paul. I saw the way you two were acting, and I know about the money. You've been stealing from us, our savings, our business, everything." Her face paled. "You don't understand. It's not what you think." "No, Daphne," Garrett interrupted, stepping closer. "It's exactly what I think. You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. The affair, the money, all of it. You're not just betraying me, you're destroying everything we've built." Tears welled up in Daphne's eyes, but instead of offering an apology, she stepped back, shaking her head. "You don't get it. I had no choice, Garrett. You were so wrapped up in your work, your career. I needed something more." Garrett felt a bitter laugh escape his lips. "So this was the solution? To tear us apart?" Daphne was silent, her face crumpling in regret, but she didn't speak. "You've hurt me, Daphne," Garrett said, his voice breaking, "and I'm done being a fool." There was no dramatic declaration of love or pleading for forgiveness. Instead, Garrett turned and walked away, leaving Daphne standing there, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and fear. The night felt colder now, the echoes of their confrontation lingering in the air. Garrett knew the road ahead would be hard, but he also knew it was the only path he could walk. The confrontation with Daphne had left Garrett reeling, but there was no time to indulge in his pain. As much as he wanted to retreat into the safety of anger, he knew he couldn't. The truth was out now, and it was only the beginning. There was so much more he had to uncover, and so much more he had to lose. But for the first time in a long while, Garrett felt a sense of clarity. He knew he couldn't go through this alone. It was late the following evening when Rick called. The phone buzzed on Garrett's desk, the name Rick Calloway flashing across the screen. Garrett's hand trembled as he picked it up. "Garrett!" Rick's voice was heavy with urgency. "I've been going over everything. I don't know how to say this, but you were right. There's more going on here than we thought." Garrett sat up, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" "There's a second layer to all of this," Rick continued. I don't know how to explain it, but there are deeper connections between Paul and Daphne that go beyond just a business relationship. It looks like they've been laundering money through charity events and personal accounts. Garrett's mind began to spin. His worst fears were coming true. This wasn't just an affair, it was something criminal, something that could ruin everything. But it wasn't the betrayal that shook him. It was the reality of how much Daphne had been hiding, how deep the deception ran. "You've got to be kidding me," Garrett said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm serious. I've already contacted some people who can help, but this goes beyond what we can handle alone. We need more intel on them, Garrett. We need proof, hard evidence." There was a long silence. Garrett's thoughts were a blur. He had no choice. He had to act fast, but he didn't know where to turn or who to trust. "Rick, do what you need to do. Get everything we can on them. We can't let this go any further." "I'm on it," Rick said. "I'll call you soon. Don't do anything rash." Garrett hung up, his thoughts racing. He had known there was something off about the situation, but this was beyond anything he could have anticipated. Daphne hadn't just betrayed him. She had put them both in danger. The next morning, Garrett received a text from an unknown number. The message was simple but chilling. "I know what they've been doing. Meet me at the usual place, tonight. Don't tell anyone." His heart skipped a beat. The usual place was a small coffee shop they used to visit, a neutral location where Garrett had met a few trusted contacts in the past. But who could this be? He had no idea. Yet something in his gut told him that this was his chance to get the answers he needed. That evening, Garrett arrived at the coffee shop, his nerves on edge. He stepped inside, scanning the room for any sign of the person who had sent him the message. And then he saw her, Emily, Rick's wife. She was sitting at a corner table, a quiet figure in the dimly lit cafe. When she saw Garrett, she waved him over, her face calm but tense. "Garrett," she greeted him, her voice low. "I'm glad you came." He took a seat across from her, his mind racing. "What's going on, Emily? Why are you involved in all this?" Emily looked around quickly before speaking. "I couldn't sit by and do nothing. You've been my friend, and I can't stand seeing you go through this alone. Rick and we've been following the trail. I've seen the way Daphne has manipulated the situation, and I've seen the way she's been using Paul." Garrett's heart pounded. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to hurt you," she said quietly. "But you need to know. Daphne isn't just after money. She's been playing both sides, using her influence to cover her tracks. The affair? It's just a small part of the bigger picture." Garrett's anger flared. "So what's next? What do we do now?" "We take it down piece by piece. We go public. Expose everything." Emily's voice was calm, yet there was a fire in her eyes. "But we need proof. That's why I'm here." Garrett leaned in, the weight of her words settling over him. She wasn't just helping as a friend. She was offering him the ally he hadn't realized he needed, the person who could help him uncover the entire web of lies and deceit that had consumed his life. "I'll do whatever it takes," Garrett said, his voice firm. Emily nodded. "I knew you would. But be careful, Garrett. This isn't just about your marriage anymore. It's about something much bigger." Garrett's mind raced as he sat in his car, the file from Rick open on the passenger seat beside him. The quiet hum of the engine felt like a distant sound, a mere background to the whirlwind in his head. The documents Rick had gathered were a nightmare unfolding in front of him, a reality he had only begun to glimpse. The deeper he dug, the worse it became. The first page showed an account transfer, a substantial sum of money transferred from one of their joint accounts to a separate account in Paul Henson's name. The amounts weren't small, they were large enough to raise red flags, large enough to make Garrett's heart pound in his chest. There were more pages, more numbers, more deposits and withdrawals, all pointing to one thing. Daphne had been lying to him. She had been siphoning money from their family accounts to fund her affair with Paul, and worse, using their business to cover her tracks. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, trying to steady his breathing. The betrayal stung more than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the deliberate destruction of his life, his family, and his trust. Everything he had built had been twisted and used against him. The file in his hands wasn't just about money, it was about control. Daphne had always been the one who handled the finances, and Garrett had trusted her completely. But now he realized that trust had been shattered long before he had ever discovered the affair. This was systematic manipulation, carefully crafted to keep him in the dark. Garrett slammed his hand on the steering wheel, a burst of frustration escaping him. His mind flashed to their earlier conversations, to the times Daphne had assured him that everything was fine, that they were fine. Everything is fine, she had said, and yet this was far from fine. The phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. It was a text from Emily. "I've sent you something, you need to see it." Garrett's stomach tightened as he quickly opened the message. It was a new set of documents, emails and communications that Rick had uncovered. They were between Daphne and Paul, discussing their next moves. But what stood out most were the financial details. They were planning something bigger than Garrett had realized. These emails were evidence of how deep Daphne's involvement with Paul ran, how much she had been pulling the strings in their marriage and business. Emily's text also included a brief note. "This is more than we thought. We need to act fast. Don't confront her yet. Get all the evidence first." Garrett's hands shook as he read through the emails. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but each new piece made the truth harder to stomach. Daphne wasn't just an unfaithful wife, she was an active participant in a scheme that could ruin everything they had built together. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. How could he confront her now? How could he face her when every word she had said to him seemed to be part of this web of lies? His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. This time it was Rick. Garrett picked up immediately. "You got the documents?" Rick asked, his voice low but urgent. "Yeah," Garrett replied, his voice tight. "I have everything. It's worse than I thought. She's been stealing from us, from me. And I think Paul's been pulling the strings the whole time." Rick's voice was calm but firm. "We need to take action, Garrett. You can't confront her yet. We need to build the case. We have the evidence, but we need more." "I know," Garrett said, running a hand through his hair again. Damn it, Rick, how did I not see this? How could I not see what was happening right in front of me?" Rick's tone softened, though he remained practical. "You were blind, Garrett. Not because you're weak, but because you trusted her. Now, we turn that trust into the weapon we need to expose her, but we do it carefully. One wrong move and she'll know what we're up to." Garrett clenched his jaw. "I won't let her get away with this." He ended the call and sat for a long moment, staring at the screen of his phone. The silence in the car felt suffocating, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a betrayal. It was about taking back control of his life, and he would stop at nothing to get the truth. The weight of the evidence was too much for Garrett to ignore. He sat in his office, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the room, and reviewed the documents again. The papers in front of him weren't just a collection of financial discrepancies. They told a story of betrayal, manipulation, and deceit on a level that Garrett had never imagined. Each transfer, each withdrawal, was a thread in a web that Daphne had carefully spun over months, maybe even years. But it wasn't just the affair anymore. It wasn't just about Paul. Daphne had been playing a much bigger game, a game that Garrett had been obliviously involved in, like a pawn in her calculated scheme. He flipped through more papers, his fingers trembling as he held the receipts of several major transactions. Money laundering. Paul had been at the center of it all. The foundation they had built, the business Garrett had poured his heart into, none of it had been what he thought it was. The charity work they had supported together was a front, a mask for something much more sinister. There were accounts in offshore banks, large sums transferred with barely any paper trail. But what chilled Garrett to his core was the realization that Daphne had been the mastermind. She had used their life together, their business, to fund her secret dealings with Paul. She had manipulated him, the business, and their shared resources, all while hiding behind the image of a loving wife and devoted partner. The room suddenly felt too small, and the air too thick. How could he have been so blind? Garrett's mind reeled, and in that moment he realized the full scope of Daphne's betrayal. The affair was just the surface. What was buried beneath was something far darker. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was Rick. "I've been going through more of the documents. There's something you need to see, Garrett." Rick's voice was tight, urgent. "I think I've uncovered more than we thought. There's a connection here that goes deeper. We need to talk. Now." Garrett's heart sank. He had suspected this for a while, that there was more to Daphne's relationship with Paul than he realized. But Rick's words confirmed it. This was no longer just about a personal betrayal. It was about something criminal, something far bigger than just them. "I'll be there in an hour," Garrett said, his voice hoarse with the weight of everything that had unfolded. The drive to Rick's office felt like a blur. Garrett's mind raced with questions. What had Rick uncovered? How deep did this go? He felt like he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that would change his life forever. When Garrett arrived, Rick was already waiting for him, his face grim. He handed Garrett a file, one that felt far too heavy to be just another set of documents. "Take a look at this," Rick said, his voice low. "I think Daphne has been in this with Paul for far longer than we realized, and it's not just about the money. This goes back years." Garrett opened the file, his eyes scanning the papers. There were dates, phone records, and emails, all showing a history of involvement between Daphne and Paul that stretched beyond business. But what caught Garrett's eye was a contract, one that Daphne had signed in the early days of their marriage. It outlined a partnership with Paul, not just as business associates, but as co-conspirators in a financial scheme to embezzle from their own charity. The betrayal hit Garrett like a physical blow. Daphne had been planning this, setting the stage for years. She hadn't just fallen into this situation, she had chosen it. She had carefully built a facade of love and commitment, all while secretly manipulating him, the business, and their community. Garrett closed the file, his hands shaking. His entire life, everything he thought he knew, had been a lie. The anger that surged through him was almost suffocating, but underneath it there was something else, something darker, a cold resolve. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. "We need to act fast," Rick said, his voice serious. "This is bigger than we thought. If we expose this, it could ruin her, not just personally, but professionally. You'll need to be ready for the fallout." Garrett nodded, his mind made up. "I'll do whatever it takes. She's not getting away with this." As he left Rick's office, Garrett felt a new clarity settle over him. Daphne hadn't just betrayed him as a husband. She had betrayed everything they had built together, everything they had promised to be. And now, it was time to expose her for what she truly was. Garrett's mind was consumed by the betrayal he had uncovered. Every time he tried to focus on something else, thoughts of Daphne, Paul, and the dark web of lies they had woven pulled him back in. The papers Rick had handed him weighed heavily on his mind, and each passing day felt like a countdown until everything exploded. As he sat at his kitchen table, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows over the pages, Garrett's phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number. It was an unfamiliar area code, one that didn't seem to fit with any of the contacts he had. Hesitantly, he opened the message. "I know what they've been doing. Meet me at the usual place. Tonight, don't tell anyone." Garrett's heart skipped a beat. The usual place was a small, quiet cafe near his office, a place where he and his closest contacts used to meet. Who was this? Could it be someone who knew more? Someone involved? His mind raced. It could be a trap, or it could be exactly what he needed, the final piece of the puzzle. He couldn't ignore it, not now. The urgency in the message was clear. Whoever this was, they knew something, and Garrett wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. He quickly typed a response. "Who is this? What do you know?" But the message was met with silence. He stared at the screen for what felt like hours, but there was no reply. The sense of unease grew within him. Was he being played, or was this a genuine lead? The cryptic message gnawed at him. He had to go. There was no choice. The stakes were too high, and he couldn't afford to let another chance slip away. That evening, Garrett arrived at the cafe, his nerves on edge. The faint hum of the neon sign outside flickered as he stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of espresso. The place was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons, and the barista behind the counter who greeted him with a quiet nod. Garrett looked around, but saw no one who appeared to be waiting for him. He walked further inside, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor, scanning the dimly lit tables. And then he saw her, Emily. She sat in the far corner, her face partially obscured by the low lighting, but Garrett recognized her immediately. He hesitated for a moment, confusion swirling within him. Emily? Why was she here? And why the secrecy? He approached her, his heart racing. As he got closer, Emily looked up and waved him over, her expression calm, though there was an unmistakable tension in her eyes. "Garrett?" she greeted him softly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Emily," he replied, his voice tight. "What's going on? Why did you text me? What is all this?" Emily looked around quickly, ensuring no one was listening before she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been tracking Daphne's movements. I know what she's been up to. She's been running a much larger operation than you realize." Garrett sat down, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean? What's going on? Is it just the affair and the money? Is there something else?" Emily nodded slowly, her eyes dark with concern. "There's more. Daphne's not just hiding money. She's been using your business as a cover for something much bigger. It involves Paul, but it doesn't stop there. She's connected with people. Dangerous people." Garrett's stomach churned. The sense of betrayal, which had already been overwhelming, now felt like an avalanche threatening to crush him. "How do you know all this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Emily glanced around the cafe once more, her gaze fleeting and nervous. "I've been doing some digging of my own. It's not just about finances or an affair. She's involved in something illegal, something far more dangerous than just taking money." Garrett felt a lump form in his throat. His mind reeled, trying to process the weight of Emily's words. This wasn't just about a personal betrayal anymore. This was about everything he had known crumbling beneath him. He thought he was dealing with a simple affair, but now he realized it was something far more sinister, something that threatened not just his marriage, but his entire life. "What do we do?" Garrett asked, his voice quieter now. Emily leaned in even closer, her tone urgent. "We expose it, but we need more proof. We need to know exactly what she's been involved in, and we need to make sure it's all connected. This goes beyond what we've seen so far." Garrett nodded, his resolve hardening. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He was in this, for better or worse, and he wasn't going to stop until he had the truth. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." Garrett sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the evidence still pressing down on him. The documents, the emails, the hidden accounts, all of it was a testament to the betrayal Daphne had orchestrated. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of lies, each wave pulling him deeper. But amidst the overwhelming pain, there was something even more heart-wrenching: the damage to his children. His son, Ben, had always been the quiet one, a sensitive soul with a deep love for his family. His daughter, Lily, on the other hand, was outspoken, fearless, and often the first to call out when something didn't feel right. Yet, both of them had felt the tension in the house, even though they couldn't articulate it. They knew their parents weren't the same, but they didn't understand why. That morning, as Garrett was lost in his thoughts, he overheard a conversation from the other room. It was Lily's voice, the high-pitched excitement of a child who hadn't yet been touched by the weight of the world. "Daddy, guess what?" she said, her voice cheerful as she burst into the kitchen. "Mommy told me that Uncle Paul is going to take us to the zoo next weekend. She said it's a surprise. Isn't that fun?" The words hit Garrett like a ton of bricks. His head snapped toward her, his eyes wide, his heart pounding in his chest. The mention of Paul, the same man who had been at the center of the affair and the conspiracy, sent a cold chill down his spine. Lily, oblivious to the storm of emotions she had just unleashed, continued chattering excitedly. "Mom said we can go on all the rides and Uncle Paul's going to buy us ice cream. I love it when we go on trips with him." Garrett's hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white as he tried to steady himself. The betrayal wasn't just with him, it was with his children too. Daphne had involved them in this mess, wrapped them in a web of lies, and now they were being used as pawns in a game he couldn't even begin to understand. Lily paused when she saw the look on Garrett's face, her excitement dimming slightly. "Daddy?" she asked, her tone turning cautious. "What's wrong?" Garrett tried to force a smile, his chest tight. "Nothing, sweetie, it's just a surprise, that's all. Let's not talk about it right now, okay?" His voice cracked, and he quickly turned his face away, unable to hide the anguish in his eyes. Lily, sensing something wasn't right but not fully understanding, nodded and bounced off to find her brother, leaving Garrett alone with the crushing weight of his thoughts. As he sat there, staring at the table, the full extent of Daphne's betrayal became clearer. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about an affair. It was about everything: his family, his children, the future he had envisioned for them. She had dragged Paul into their lives, into their children's hearts, as though he were just another uncle, another trusted figure. The rage inside him grew, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, paralyzing sadness. The realization hit him. The damage was already done. He had already lost something irreplaceable: the trust of his children, their innocence. Garrett stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he paced the room, his hands running through his hair in frustration. He could feel the anger boiling within him, but beneath that there was a deep sense of helplessness. How could he explain to his children that the man they were so excited to see, the man they adored, was the same person who had helped destroy everything? He couldn't protect them from this. Daphne had already involved them in her web of lies, and now it was up to him to figure out how to fix the mess she had created. But how could he? What could he possibly do to make this right? Garrett knew there was no going back. The truth had already been laid bare. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His marriage, his family, it was all slipping through his fingers. And the hardest part was knowing that despite everything, he still loved Daphne. But now there was no choice. He had to expose her for what she was, for his children, for himself. Garrett sat at his desk, his hands trembling as he reviewed the pile of documents Rick had sent him. The evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about something far more insidious. Daphne's betrayal was no longer confined to her personal relationship with Paul. It extended into their business, their finances, and their entire life together. What had once seemed like a simple case of infidelity was now a deep, tangled web of lies and manipulation. The more Garrett uncovered, the worse it became. Daphne had been using their shared business, an interior design company they had built together over the years, as a front for her dealings with Paul. It wasn't just money being funneled into their pockets, it was much more. There were bank accounts in offshore locations, large sums transferred under the guise of business expenses, and several shady investments that seemed to have no real purpose. As Garrett flipped through the pages, the weight of the situation settled over him. This wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a betrayal of everything they had worked for. He had been complicit in the lies, trusting Daphne with everything, from their finances to their family, all while she had been secretly plotting behind his back. Garrett leaned back in his chair, the reality of it all sinking in. Daphne had been living a double life, one that she had carefully hidden from him. She had used him, manipulated him, and built a life based on deception. And the worst part? He hadn't even seen it coming. How could he have been so blind? His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Rick. "I've got more, you need to see this." Garrett's heart raced. The feeling of dread that had been building inside him intensified. He couldn't stop now. He had to know everything. He grabbed his phone and dialed Rick's number, his fingers shaking as the line rang. "Garrett, listen." Rick's voice came through, urgent. "I've uncovered something else. Something that ties Daphne and Paul to a much larger operation. It's not just about the money anymore. They've been involved in something illegal for years." Garrett's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "Money laundering, fraud, the whole thing," Rick explained. "I've got records of transactions between Daphne and some very shady individuals. This isn't just personal, it's criminal." The air in the room seemed to thicken as Garrett processed Rick's words. His mind raced, but he couldn't focus. Everything he thought he knew, everything he trusted, had been shattered. Daphne hadn't just betrayed him personally. She had endangered their entire future, their business, their livelihood. "Where do we go from here?" Garrett asked, his voice quiet. "We need to gather more evidence," Rick said firmly. "We need to expose everything, but it's going to take time. We need to be careful." Garrett's thoughts swirled as he hung up. He felt trapped, caught between the rage of betrayal and the cold clarity of what needed to be done. He had to act, but every step felt like a leap into the unknown. The next day, Garrett confronted Daphne. He had waited long enough, and now there was no more running from the truth. He had all the evidence. He was done being kept in the dark. He found her in their living room, sitting on the couch, looking as composed as ever. When she saw him, her eyes flickered with a momentary shift, something like guilt, but quickly masked by a practiced smile. "Garrett, you're home early," she said, her voice sweet but distant. He stood in the doorway, holding up the stack of papers. "I know everything, Daphne, everything." Her face went pale. The confidence she had exuded moments before disappeared, replaced by a flicker of panic. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I know about Paul," Garrett said, his voice cold. "About the money, the accounts, everything. I know what you've been doing behind my back." Daphne stood up quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to defensiveness. "Garrett, you don't understand. I was just trying to protect us. Everything I did was for you, for the business, for our family." The words hit Garrett like a slap. "For us? You've been lying, Daphne, manipulating everything we built. You don't get to justify this. You don't get to say it was for me." She opened her mouth to protest, but he didn't let her speak. "I've seen everything. You've been using me, using this family to cover your tracks, and now everything is ruined." Her eyes darted nervously around the room as if searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. Garrett had cornered her, and the reality of her actions was beginning to sink in. "This isn't just about an affair anymore, Daphne," Garrett said, his voice growing colder. "This is about everything you've done, and it's time for you to face the consequences." The courtroom was filled with tension. Garrett stood at the edge of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He felt like an outsider in his own life, watching as his world unraveled before him. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions. But now, as he stood here, facing the woman he had loved for so many years, he felt a weight he couldn't escape. Daphne sat across from him, her once confident demeanor now a mask of carefully constructed composure. She sat next to her lawyer, a sharp, seasoned woman who seemed more prepared for battle than anything else. Garrett's lawyer, Rick, stood beside him, offering a quiet word of reassurance. But nothing could calm the storm brewing inside Garrett. The stakes were high, higher than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about their marriage anymore. This was about exposing the truth, about making Daphne face the consequences of her actions. The judge entered the room, and the murmur of conversation died down immediately. As the proceedings began, Garrett's mind wandered back to the moment everything had changed. The moment he had discovered the truth about Daphne's betrayal. The moment he had learned that she wasn't just having an affair with Paul, but that she had been using their business as a front for a series of illegal financial transactions. The truth had shattered him, but it had also given him the strength to act. He had been careful, gathering all the evidence he could. He had painstakingly documented everything, the emails, the bank transfers, the phone records, and had handed it all over to Rick. Together, they had pieced together the full extent of Daphne's lies. The affair had been just the tip of the iceberg. The money laundering, the fraudulent business deals, the manipulation of their family's finances, it all came crashing down, and now it was time for Daphne to answer for it. The judge called the case to order. The room fell silent as each side prepared to present their arguments. Daphne's lawyer spoke first, painting her as the victim of an emotionally distant and controlling husband. She claimed that Garrett had been neglectful of his duties as a husband and a father, pushing Daphne to seek comfort in Paul's arms. The accusation stung, but Garrett forced himself to remain calm. He knew the truth, and he had the evidence to prove it. When it was Garrett's turn to speak, his voice shook for only a moment before he regained his composure. He stood up, facing the judge and the room full of strangers, and began to recount the betrayal that had torn his life apart. I never imagined that my wife, the woman I trusted with everything, would be capable of such deception. Garrett began, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. What I discovered was far beyond an affair. Daphne manipulated me, our family, and our business. She used our life together to cover up illegal activities that have now put us all in danger. The room was quiet as Garrett presented the evidence, documents detailing the hidden bank accounts, fraudulent business dealings, and the money that had been funneled into Paul's pockets. The shock on the faces of the people in the room was palpable, but Garrett knew that this was only the beginning. He had to stay strong. He couldn't let Daphne spin her lies any longer. Daphne's lawyer tried to discredit Garrett's evidence, claiming it was circumstantial and accusing him of overreacting. But the weight of the documents, the undeniable proof, made her arguments weak. With each passing moment, it became clear that the truth was on Garrett's side. As the session ended for the day, Garrett felt a mixture of relief and dread. The first step had been taken, but the battle was far from over. He had exposed Daphne's lies, but there was still so much to be done. He had no idea what the final outcome would be, but he couldn't stop now. He had come this far, and he would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The trial would drag on for days, but as Garrett left the courtroom, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He had stepped into the light, and now there was no going back. The truth was out there, and there was no hiding it anymore. Daphne would have to face the consequences of her actions, and Garrett would finally reclaim his life. The trial was growing more intense with each passing day. Garrett had presented his case, his voice steady despite the flood of emotions that still surged within him. The evidence was undeniable, the financial records, the hidden accounts. Everything had been laid bare for all to see. But even as the truth started to unravel, he felt something was missing. Daphne had yet to truly break down. She was still clinging to her story, manipulating the narrative. It was a cold, overcast morning when the unexpected witness appeared, Emily. Rick had been in the back of the courtroom, his usual calm demeanor masking the strain he had been feeling. Garrett's hope was running thin. He had already presented all of the evidence. Yet, Daphne's lawyer was a formidable force, constantly shifting the focus back onto Garrett's character, trying to paint him as a controlling, paranoid husband. Garrett's eyes flicked over to Emily, who had been sitting in the back, mostly quiet. He had no idea what had brought her here today. He hadn't expected her to be a part of the trial. And yet, here she was, the last person he expected to step forward. Rick caught Garrett's gaze and nodded subtly. It was time. Emily stood up, her movements deliberate but calm. The room fell silent as she made her way to the witness stand. Daphne's lawyer glanced at her, clearly startled, but did not protest. Emily took the oath and sat down, her eyes never leaving Garrett. "Miss Calloway," the judge addressed her, "please state your name for the court." "Emily Calloway," she responded clearly. "I'm Rick Calloway's wife." The courtroom was silent as Emily spoke. Her calm presence was like a steady anchor in the chaos that surrounded the case. "Miss Calloway, can you tell the court how you are involved in this case?" the prosecutor asked. Emily's gaze shifted briefly to Garrett before meeting the eyes of the jury. She seemed to gather herself, choosing her words carefully. "I've known Garrett for years," she began. "When all of this came to light, I couldn't sit by and do nothing. I've seen Daphne's behavior firsthand. She's been manipulative, not just with Garrett, but with everyone around her. She's hidden things, used people, for her own gain." There was a collective intake of breath in the courtroom. Daphne's eyes narrowed, and Garrett could see the tension ripple through her. Emily was going places that Garrett hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just speaking about the affair. She was speaking to the heart of the deception. "Can you explain what you mean by manipulation?" the prosecutor asked, his voice sharp. Emily nodded slowly, her voice unwavering. "I'm not just talking about the affair with Paul. I'm talking about how Daphne has used her relationship with Paul to cover up a lot of things that go beyond the personal. She and Paul have been involved in illegal activities, money laundering, fraudulent transactions, and using Garrett's business as a shield. I've seen them work together, planning everything. I couldn't stand by and let it continue." Garrett's heart pounded in his chest. He had never expected Emily to be the one to make these revelations, but as she spoke, he felt the weight of truth pressing in around him. Daphne's face had gone pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She couldn't argue with this. Emily's words were the confirmation Garrett had been waiting for. "Miss Calloway," the prosecutor pressed, "do you have any proof of these allegations?" Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. She handed it to the prosecutor, who passed it to the judge. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge reviewed the contents. The folder contained more than just testimony. It contained documents, emails, and photos, evidence of Daphne's involvement in the illegal scheme, corroborating what Emily had said. It was more than Garrett had ever expected to uncover, but it was undeniable. Daphne's lawyer stood up, his face reddening with frustration. "Objection, Your Honor. This is all circumstantial. None of it connects my client directly to any crime." The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Sustained. However, the witness will be allowed to continue." Emily's calmness remained unchanged as she faced the judge. "I understand how this may seem, but I've seen what Daphne is capable of. She's been hiding it all for so long, playing a game with all of us." Daphne's gaze flicked toward the door as if considering leaving, but the reality of the situation had set in. She had no way to deny it now. Her web of lies had been torn apart, and with Emily's testimony, the final pieces fell into place. Garrett stood silently as Emily's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about winning the trial. This was about exposing everything Daphne had hidden. The truth had been revealed, not just for him, but for the world to see. "Thank you, Miss Calloway," the prosecutor said as Emily left the stand. Garrett's heart felt heavier than ever. This wasn't over yet, but with Emily's unexpected testimony, it felt like a turning point. The walls were closing in on Daphne, and she could no longer run from the truth. The courtroom was still, an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Daphne sat at the defendant's table, her posture stiff, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. Her once confident demeanor had crumbled in the wake of Emily's testimony, and now she appeared more fragile than ever. The truth was out. There was no way to deny it now. Garrett sat across from her, his eyes cold, his heart heavy. He had come to this moment not just seeking justice, but hoping against all odds that the woman he had once loved, who had torn apart his life, would finally face the consequences of her actions. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but watching Daphne crumble before him brought a strange sense of clarity. This was his moment, the moment where everything she had hidden would be brought to light. The prosecutor stood up, ready to close the case. His voice was firm, commanding as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence you've seen over the past few days is undeniable. We've presented the proof of Daphne McKinley's involvement in a multi-layered financial scheme, spanning not only her illicit affair with Paul Henson, but also her manipulation of her husband's business, his finances, and their life together. She has stolen from her family, from her business, and from the people who trusted her." Garrett's gaze never left Daphne. He could see the fear in her eyes now, the desperation. She had never thought it would come to this, the walls closing in on her, the lies finally exposed. She had spent so long crafting the perfect image of herself, the loving wife, the dedicated mother, the successful businesswoman, and yet here she was, her true self laid bare with nowhere left to hide. The prosecutor continued, "Daphne McKinley used her position to cover up her deceitful actions. She lied to her husband, her children, and to everyone around her. This wasn't just a momentary lapse of judgment. This was a carefully executed plan, one that involved money laundering, fraud, and the destruction of the very business that Garrett McKinley built with his own hands. The evidence, including bank transfers, emails, and witness testimonies, shows the deliberate nature of her actions." Garrett could hear the weight of the words hanging in the air. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about criminal behavior, about taking everything Garrett had worked for and using it to cover her own tracks. The financial documents, the testimonies, Emily's unexpected revelation, they were all part of the proof that had slowly dismantled Daphne's defenses. As the prosecutor finished his statement, Garrett felt a cold sense of finality. This was it. The trial was almost over, and Daphne's fate rested in the hands of the jury. Daphne's lawyer stood to make his defense, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to discredit the evidence presented. He argued that Garrett had been emotionally abusive, that Daphne had been forced into a position where she had to act in secret. But his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The jury wasn't buying it. They had seen through the lies. Garrett could barely stand to listen to the defense. It was clear that Daphne's lawyer was clutching at straws, trying to redirect the blame, but the truth had already been laid out. The affair, the fraud, the stolen money, it all pointed back to Daphne. There was no escaping the reality anymore. The judge called for a short recess before the jury would deliberate. As the room emptied, Garrett remained seated, feeling numb. He couldn't escape the wave of emotion that had been building in him for days, anger, betrayal, but also a strange sense of relief. This chapter of his life was finally coming to a close. He was finally going to be free of the woman who had torn him apart. As Garrett gathered his things, he caught a glimpse of Daphne. She was sitting alone now, her head bent, her hands shaking in her lap. For a fleeting moment, Garrett felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that this was her own doing. She had chosen this path, and now she would have to face the consequences. Rick walked over to Garrett, offering a small, supportive smile. "It's almost over," he said quietly. "You did it. You've exposed the truth." Garrett nodded, but the words felt hollow. This wasn't just a victory. It was the end of everything he had known. His marriage was over, his trust shattered, and his family forever altered. He had fought for justice, but what did it really mean when everything had already been broken? As the jury returned and the judge called the court back into session, Garrett's thoughts were a whirlwind. He tried to focus on what was happening, but all he could think about was the life he had once had, before the lies, before the betrayal. He couldn't change the past, but at least now he could start to rebuild. When the verdict was read, Garrett stood tall. Daphne had been found guilty. The weight of the words sank in, but there was no triumph in Garrett's chest. He had won, but the cost had been too great. Daphne's downfall was complete. But as Garrett left the courtroom, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would rebuild his life piece by piece. The courthouse doors closed behind Garrett with a heavy thud, and for a moment the world seemed to go still. He stood in the hallway, his hands clenched at his sides, the weight of the trial finally sinking in. Daphne had been convicted. The life they had built, the facade of a perfect family, was officially over. Yet, as he stood there, victorious, there was no sense of triumph, only a deep, aching void. For days he had told himself that exposing Daphne's betrayal, her lies, would bring him peace, that seeing justice served would fill the emptiness that had been growing inside him since the moment he found out about the affair. But now, with everything laid bare, he felt no relief, only an overwhelming sense of loss. His life, his marriage, the family he had worked so hard to protect, all of it was shattered. Garrett turned, heading for the exit, his steps slow and heavy. His mind replayed the events of the past months, each one more painful than the last. But the most painful of all was the look in his children's eyes when they had asked him where their mother had gone, the innocence of their questions, the way they couldn't understand why she wasn't there anymore. It was a question Garrett couldn't answer. The car ride home was silent. His hands gripped the steering wheel as his thoughts raced, but there was no clarity. The road ahead seemed unclear. He could no longer see the future he had once envisioned for himself. Everything had changed, and he was left to figure out how to rebuild from the wreckage of his past. When he got home, the house felt empty, even though it was filled with the noise of the television and the usual mess of toys left on the floor. His children were playing, their laughter filling the air. But Garrett couldn't shake the weight of the silence that pressed down on him. It was a quiet dinner that evening. Ben and Lily chatted about their day, their innocence a stark contrast to the storm that raged inside their father. Garrett tried to smile, tried to be present, but all he could think about was Daphne. Her absence was a physical ache in the pit of his stomach. She wasn't here. She hadn't been here for months. The betrayal was too deep, too painful. to allow for anything other than regret. As the night wore on, Garrett found himself retreating to his bedroom. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space beside him, the place where Daphne used to lie. For a moment, he almost imagined she was still there, but when he reached out to touch the pillow, the coldness of it reminded him that she was gone. Gone not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. His thoughts returned to the trial, to Daphne sitting in that courtroom, her face a mask of false composure. How had it come to this? He remembered the days when everything seemed perfect, when he believed in their future, in their family, in her. But that future was a lie. It had been a lie for far too long. He heard the faint sound of footsteps outside the door. Ben and Lily were still awake, their small voices drifting through the cracks. Garrett's heart softened, but it was a fleeting moment. He knew they needed him, but he felt so far removed from everything. How could he be the father they needed when he was barely holding himself together? How could he protect them from the pain they would eventually have to understand? Garrett closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the hurt Daphne had caused, the pain that had torn their family apart. But he could try to be better for them, for Ben and Lily. They didn't deserve to carry the burden of this destruction. They deserved something better. And somehow Garrett knew that the only way he could start healing was to rebuild for them, piece by piece. The guilt of not being able to shield them from the truth weighed heavily on him. But deep down he knew that he could no longer live in the shadows of his past. He had to step forward, even if it meant walking alone for a while. The path to healing wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only path he could take. As he lay down that night, his mind quieting, he finally allowed himself to drift into a restless sleep. It wasn't peace that came to him in his dreams, but a quiet determination. Tomorrow, he would begin again. He would take the first step toward building something new, something real, for himself and for the children he still had the power to protect.